Has the world ever made you feel like you were lost? A way out of this maze is offered by Stoicism, a philosophy influenced by the great Greek thinkers. It's not just about old knowledge, it's a trip into the heart of Stoicism, looking at its strong ideas and bold language. You're not just learning about Stoicism by listening this video, you're also going on a journey through its principles of virtue, wisdom, and ethics, and finding out how these timeless ideas still apply today. As you continue to listen to my voice, you can expect to be both pushed and soothed by the Stoic principles. This isn't just a philosophy lesson, it's also an opportunity to change your life. Welcome to the world of Stoicism. Your journey begins now. In the ancient era, philosophy was as important to the Greeks and Romans as faith is to us today. They used reason, not revelation, to make their case. Cicero asks in his Offices, "When we want to learn virtue, what else should we look to besides philosophy?" If people think that truth comes from authority, it makes sense that they should be taught this from a very young age. What's important is that they believe it. Truths that speak to reason, on the other hand, must be happy to wait until reason grows. We are all born into a particular denomination, whether it be Eastern, Western, Anglican, or another, but the serious-minded young Greek or Roman chose to follow the teachings of one of the major schools of philosophy. He may have done it because of a friend's advice or a speech from a great orator, but once he made up his mind, he stuck to it. Conversions from one group to another didn't happen very often. He was called the deserter because he switched from the Stoics to the Cyrenaics. It was hard to be independent in philosophy, just like it is hard for us to be independent in politics. When a boy joined a school, he agreed with everything it said, not just about death, which was the main point of disagreement, but about everything there was to talk about. The Stoic and the Epicurean had different ideas about more than just ethics. They had different ideas about religion, science, and philosophy as well. It is known that Aristotle believed that boys were unfit to hear moral philosophy. The young man's views on all other issues were, however, based on his answer to this question, or rather, this question of moral philosophy. Cicero sometimes talks about how important the choices we make early in life are, and how a young man gets caught up in a school before he is really able to decide. This makes us think of what people say these days about how dangerous it is for a young man to follow orders before he has formed his own opinions. It was answered that a young man only used his right to private opinion to choose which authority he should follow, and after that, he trusted that authority for everything else. We are also familiar with the similar argument that was made in the past. Cicero agrees that it might make sense if the philosophic mind wasn't the most important thing that was needed to find a real philosopher. But back then, as now, it was likely that if a man didn't form speculative views when he was young, he wouldn't have time to do so later because of the stress of life. Zeno was the father of Stoicism. He lived from BC 347 to 275. He didn't start teaching until 315, when he was 40 years old and had grown up. He died in 322, and with him, the great age of creative Greek thought came to an end. Philosophers from Ionian times thought about the physical structure of the universe. Philosophers from Pythagorean times thought about the magical properties of numbers. Heraclitus talked about his philosophy of fire, and philosophers from Democritus and Leucippus came up with a rough version of the atomic theory. Socrates asked questions about people, and Plato and Aristotle talked about them informally, but in a methodical way. The schools that came after didn't add much to the field of philosophy. What they did was stress different aspects of the ideology that came before them and push ideas to the limits of what made sense. The most important thing to learn from Greek philosophy is that doing the right thing is worth it, no matter what the consequences are or how short life is. This lesson has become more closely linked to the Stoics because of how seriously they lived their lives and how much they taught about right and wrong. After all, Cicero always thought of himself as an academic. But in one place he says that he thinks the Stoics are the only philosophers, and he uses Stoic language when he is arguing against Epicureanism. Some of Virgil's most beautiful writings seem to have been influenced by Stoic ideas. The Stoics phrase is used by even Horace, who jokes about the teacher. They were the ones who made Persius and Juvenal reach their best levels of oratory. Through Roman law, their moral philosophy had an effect on the whole world. The great masters of law were raised under its impact. This moral philosophy of the Stoics was so widespread that the Jews of Alexandria read it into Moses through metaphor and said it was the real meaning of the Hebrew sacred texts. The Stoics didn't really add much to philosophy, but they did a great job of making it well known and useful in everyday life. Late Greek philosophy was known for being very useful. This was true of both Stoicism and its rival, Epicureanism. Despite having different ideas about what that art should be, both viewed philosophy as the art of life. Even though the two schools were mostly at odds with each other, they did share some things. When they were kids, the free city had given way to monarchs, and personal life had taken the place of business life. Happiness is no longer a question for the state, as it was with Aristotle and even more so with Plato. It is a question for each person. There wasn't much interest in speculation at either school at first, and it only got weaker over time. Both were new ways of doing things at places that already existed. Epicureanism grew out of cynicism, and Stoicism grew out of cynicism. For their physics, they were happy to use ideas from before Socrates. One used Heraclitus's strong philosophy, and the other used Democritus' atomic theory. Both were strongly against Plato and Aristotle's ideas about ideas that are not things, but ideas. They would only accept real things. The Stoics and the Epicureans both cared about things, but in different ways. When it comes to the nature of the greatest God, we could agree with Seneca that the difference between the two schools is a battle between the senses and the intellect. However, as we will see soon, the Stoics thought of the intellect as a person. All of the Greeks agreed that life had a goal or end, and they called it happiness. But that was the end of their agreement. There were a huge number of different ideas about what happiness is. Democritus said it was mental peace, Anaxagoras said it was thought, Socrates said it was knowledge, Aristotle said it was practicing virtue with some luck, and Aristippus said it was just happiness. These were the philosophers' thoughts. But besides these, there were also the views of regular men, which could be seen in the way they lived their lives rather than the words they used. At first glance, Zeno's addition to the subject doesn't seem to shed light on it. Because he said the goal was to live consistently, it was clear that only the emotionless life of reason could be consistent with itself in the end. Cleanthes, who took over the school right after him, is said to have added the words, "with nature," which completed the famous Stoic formula that the goal is to live in harmony with nature. The Greeks thought that nature's ways were the ways of pleasure, and that all her paths led to peace. This may seem strange to us now, but that's because we don't use the word nature in the same way they did. We use the phrase to talk about where something came from, but they used it to talk about where it should go. When we say natural state, they meant the highest level of civilization, and when we say things nature, we mean what it is or has been. They meant what it should become under the best circumstances. To the Greeks, the natural apple wasn't the sour crab, but the sweet glory of the Hesperides that a sleepless dragon would protect. As a result, Aristotle said that the state is a natural product because it grew out of social relationships that are natural. In fact, the Greeks and we all use the word nature in very vague ways. The Peripatetics, on the other hand, said that the nature of something is the end of its becoming. Another formulation from them makes the point even more clear. What each thing is when its growth has been completed, that we declare to be the nature of each thing. The Stoics thought that living in harmony with nature was the same as living in harmony with the best level of perfection that a person could reach. Man, being a sensible animal, had to live a rational life as part of his job as a man. Plus, virtue was the best thing about reason. In this way, the ways of nature were the same as the ways of virtue. Because of this, the Stoic formula could be written in a number of different ways that all meant the same thing. To achieve this goal, one had to live a good life, be steady, act in line with nature, or think logically. The Stoics said that philosophy was the knowledge of things divine and human. Philosophy was split into three parts: science, ethics, and logic. This split did exist before they came along, but they are giving credit for it like they do for other things they didn't start. Not only them, but also a lot of other people thought the same thing. People say that the Epicureans didn't believe in logic, but it's hard to see them as being against this three-way split. In the same way that Bacon replaced Aristotle's organon with his novum organum, they replaced Stoic logic with their own logic that dealt with ideas that came from sense. We are told that Cleanthes saw 6 parts of philosophy: logic, rhetoric, ethics, politics, physics, and religion. However, it is clear that these are just subsets of the main ones. We could say that reasoning is about how knowledge is expressed and shown, physics is about what knowledge is, and ethics is about how knowledge is used. In this way, too, the divide might make sense. Philosophy must either study nature, including the divine nature, or people. If it studies people, it must look at them from the point of view of the mind, or the point of view of the emotions, that is, as a being who thinks, logic, or acts, ethics. We have kept the exact words of Chrysippus from his 4th book on Lives that tell us the order in which to study the different subjects. First of all, it seems to me that, as has been said by the ancients, there are 3 heads under which the speculations of the philosopher fall: logic, ethic, and physic. Next, that of these the logical should come first, the ethical second, and the physical third, and that of the physical, the treatment of the gods, should come last. Whence also they have given the name of completions to the instruction delivered on this subject. In spite of this statement about the order of treatment, Plutarch twits Chrysippus with inconsistency by saying that values are based on physics. To this charge, it is fair to say that the order of presentation does not have to match the order of reality. In a metaphysical sense, values may rely on physics, and the right way for people to act may be clear from the way the world is put together, but it might be best to learn physics later. Physics was about what God and the universe are made of. That might help us figure out what kind of person we are, but we already know that about ourselves, so it might be best to start with the end of the stick we have in our hands. But Chrysippus did teach that morals are logically linked to physics. This is clear from what he wrote. In his 3rd book on the gods, he writes, "For there is no other or more appropriate way of approaching the subject of good and evil, on the virtues or happiness, than from the nature of all things and the administration of the universe. For it is to these we must attach the treatment of good and evil, insofar as there is no better origin to which we can refer them, and insofar as physical speculation is a form of speculation." The school liked to use the image of philosophy as a garden or farm that is full of fruit. The good fruit was ethics, the tall trees were physics, and the strong wall was reasoning. The wall was only there to protect the trees, and the trees were only there to grow food. Or, alternatively, philosophy was compared to an egg, with logic serving as the hard outer shell, and ethics serving as the yolk that contained the chick. Posidonius, who joined the school later, didn't like the image from the orchard because he said that the parts of philosophy were not separate from each other, but the parts of the food, the trees, and the wall were. So he chose to compare it to a living thing, with logic being the bones and muscles, physics being the flesh and blood, and ethics being the spirit. The Stoics were known for being very smart. They came after Aristotle in this area, or more accurately, they took over from him. It is said that after Theophrastus died, the library of the Lyceum was buried underground at Skepsis until about 100 years before Christ. This means that the Organon may have been lost to history during that time. In any case, the school had lost its broad scope under Strato, who took over from Theophrastus and was an expert in natural science. In fact, Cicero thinks it's appropriate for dramatic purposes to have Cato say that the later peripatetics don't understand logic. On the other hand, Chrysippus was known for his logic so much that many people thought that if there was a logic among the gods, it would be the Chryssippean. When it came to speech, though, the Stoics were not very good. These strengths and weaknesses have always been a part of the school, and Cato is the only Roman Stoic that Cicero thinks is truly eloquent. When Marcus Aurelius talks about the dying accents of the school, the imperial sage thinks it's a good thing that he has learned to avoid speech, poetry, and fancy language. However, the reader can't help but wish that he had done something to make his style less crabby. There is a lesson to be learned about how important it is to sacrifice to the graces in the fact that all of the early Stoic writers have died, even though they were very smart, and their writings can be found mostly in Cicero. We need to remember that the word logic used to mean a lot more than it does now when we talk about it as one of the three branches of philosophy. There was dialectic, which is the correct form of reasoning, as well as speech, poetry, language, and discussions about the senses and the mind, which we will now call psychology. There are two main parts of logic, rhetoric and dialectic. Rhetoric is the skill of knowing how to speak clearly in explanatory situations, and dialectic is the skill of knowing how to fight correctly in question and answer situations. The Stoics thought of eloquence and dialectic as virtues because they divided virtue into its most general form in the same way that they split philosophy into three main areas: the physical, the moral, and the logical. So, rhetoric and dialectic were the two types of rational virtue. Zeno showed how different they were by saying that dialectic was like a hand and rhetoric was like a palm. Instead of mixing speech, poetry, and grammar, the Stoics split dialectic into two parts, one that dealt with meaning and the other with sound. As Chrysippus put it, it was about significance and significates. It covered things like the alphabet, the parts of speech, solecism, barbarism, poems, amphiboles, meter, and music. At first glance, this list seems a bit disorganized, but it does show the main ideas of grammar, which are broken down into phonology, accidence, and prosody. The way language dealt with solecism and barbarism was the same way logic dealt with errors. It's interesting to note that the Stoics knew 7 vowels and 6 mutes when it came to the alphabet. We talk about 9 mutes, but this is a better way to say it because the aspirate sounds are clearly not mute. The Stoics said that speech had 5 parts: the name, the appellative, the verb, the conjunction, and the article. The word name meant a proper name, and the word appellative meant a phrase. People thought that speech had 5 virtues: Hellenism, clarity, brevity, proper behavior, and difference. Hellenism meant being able to speak Greek well. Distinction was described as a language which avoided homeliness. Against these, there were 2 general vices: barbarism and solecism. Barbarism was an offense against accidentality, and solecism was an offense against grammar. The famous Stoics are the ones who said that a child's mind is like a blank sheet of paper. This idea is closely linked to the name of Locke. The first characters that were written on it were the impressions of sense, which the Greeks called fantasies. Zeno defined a fantasy as an impression in the soul. Cleanthes was happy to take this literally and think that the soul was impressed by outside things like wax, by a signet ring. Chrysippus, on the other hand, had a hard time with this and thought the master was talking about a change in the soul. He thought to himself that the soul was changing every time something outside of it acted on it, like how the air changes when many people talk at once. He also said that the soul was completely passive when it received an impression, and that the fantasy showed both its own presence and that of its cause, just like light shows itself and what's inside it. So, when we see something white, our souls feel something, and as a result, we can say that there is a white object touching us in virtue. Understanding gives you the power to name the thing. The fantasy must come first, and since understanding has the power to speak, it uses speech to show how much it loves the thing. The phantast, like the white or cold object, was what caused the bad dream. If there is no outside cause, then the thing that made the impression was probably a phantasm, like a dream figure or the furies that Orestes sees when he is crazy. So how could one tell the difference between an image that was based in truth and one that wasn't? By the feel was all the Stoics could say in response to this question. They agreed with Hume that the difference between sense impressions and ideas is that ideas are more vivid. The only difference was that the Stoics thought it was important to go beyond the impression, while Hume didn't. They said that some impressions made people feel strongly that they were real, and not just in the sense that they existed. They also said that these impressions could be traced back to an outside cause. Grabbing fantasies were these kinds of fantasies. They didn't need proof that they existed or that their prey existed. It was proof of itself. When it happened, the soul gave in and agreed with what was happening, because it is just as normal for the soul to agree with what is obvious as it is to look out for its own good. The soul's strong grip on reality was shown by comprehension, the word for giving in to a gripping fantasy. A gripping fantasy was one that was imprinted and stamped from an existing object in such a way that it could not be from a non-existent object in virtue of that object itself. The phrase, "in virtue of that object itself," was added to the meaning to protect against situations like Orestes's, who is crazy and thinks his sister is a fury. In that case, the image came from a real thing, but not from the object itself. Instead, it came from the mind of the person who saw it. Back then, the gripping fantasy was the only thing that could tell the truth. At least that's what the early Stoics taught, but the later ones added a catchphrase, "when there is no impediment." This is because their opponents used made-up stories like Admetus seeing his wife in action but not believing it to be her. But there was something in the way here. Aeneas didn't think the dead could come back to life. When Menelaus found the real Helen on the island of Pharos, he still didn't believe her. But again, there was something that got in the way, because no one could have thought that Menelaus would know that he had been fighting for a ghost for 10 years. But when there wasn't any such thing blocking them, they said the scary dream did live up to its name because it almost grabbed men by the hair and forced them to agree. So far, we've only used fantasy to talk about real or imagined sense experiences. However, the Stoics did not limit the term in this way. They split fantasies into two groups, reasonable and not sensible. These came from understanding and were about things that didn't have bodies and could only be understood through reason. They said that Plato's thoughts only existed in our heads. Horse, man, and animal were all ghosts of the soul and didn't really exist. To sum up, the Stoics were what we now call conceptualists. The word comprehension was also used in a more general way than we have before. There was understanding based on the senses, like the difference between white and black or rough and smooth. There was also understanding based on facts, like the fact that the gods exist and exercise justice. This makes us think of what Locke said: "It is as certain that there is a God as that the angles formed by the intersection of two straight lines are equal." The Stoics and Locke were very similar, or rather Locke was similar to the Stoics. The way that Stoics explain how the mind comes up with ideas sounds a lot like the first book of Locke's essay. There are up to 9 ways to come up with simple ideas. The first is by showing them, like how you get the idea of Socrates from a picture of him. The second is by analogy, which means by comparison, like how you get the idea of giants and pygmies from pictures of people, or how you get the idea of the center of the earth from looking at smaller spheres. 4. Through change, like the thought of guys with eyes in their breasts. 5. By putting together, like the idea of a centaur. 6. The idea of death is different from the idea of life. 7. Through a change, like how words work and what a place is. 8. By nature, as the idea of what is fair and good. 9. By lack, as handleless. The Stoics were a lot like Locke, in that they tried to come up with a meaning of knowledge that included both the reports of the senses and the connections between ideas. Their idea of knowledge was that it was a sure understanding or a habit in accepting fantasies that couldn't be changed by reason. At first glance, these definitions might seem to only cover knowledge that comes from the senses. But if we think about what comprehension and fantasy mean in a broader sense, we can see that they apply to the mind's grasp on both the force of a demonstration and the existence of a physical object. With the touch of Asian symbols that made him unique, Zeno used motions to show his students the steps to gain knowledge, putting out his right hand and saying, "That is a fantasy," then squeezing the fingers together a bit to say, "That is assent," then closing his fist and saying, "That is comprehension," and finally squeezing his left hand tightly around his right fist to say, "That is knowledge." It was said that an idea similar to our word concept is a dream of what a logical animal would understand, because an idea was just a dream when it came to a logical mind. In the same way, a lot of shillings and sovereigns are just shillings and sovereigns when they are not being used as payment for something. Ideas came about in part through nature and in part through study and teaching. The first type of ideas were called expectations, and the second type were just called ideas. Of the general ideas that nature gives us, reason was fully developed around the age of 14. This is when the voice, which is its outward and obvious sign, reaches its full development, and the human animal is complete in other ways, such as being able to reproduce its kind. The Stoics said that reason, which connected us to the gods, was not a basic idea that existed from the start, but something that grew out of sense over time. One could really say that for them, the senses were the mind. The Stoics thought that being was limited to the body. This was a bold claim, and we will see what happened later. For now, it's enough to just see how much trouble it causes between the groups. The first of Aristotle's 10 categories, substance, is the only one that is still valid, but only in the simplest sense, as primary substance. But a material or body could be seen in 4 different ways. 1. As a body by itself. 2. As a body of a certain type. 3. As a body in a certain state. And 4. As a body in a certain relationship. So, the 4 Stoic categories of bases, such like, so disposed, so related, come into being. But this would not bring the bodiless out of existence, because what was to be made of things like words, time, space, and the endless void? Even the Stoics didn't give these things bodies, but they had to be known about and talked about. It was solved by creating an upper group of somewhat, which should include both bodies and bodies without bodies. Time and space were both kind of things, but neither of them had being. When the Stoics thought about the idea, they mixed up language and logic a lot. Their name was broad enough to cover any part of language, like a word or words, a sentence, or even a syllogism, which is what we will call a dict. A dict was then described as that which exists in correspondence with a rational fantasy. The Stoics agreed that a dict did not have a body. When something was said, there were three parts: the sound, the sense, and the outside object. Both the first and last ones were bodies, but the one in the middle wasn't. As Seneca said, "You see Cato walking. What your eyes see and your mind attends to is a body in motion. Then you say, Cato is walking." The sound of these words is air moving, which is obviously a body, but what they mean is an announcement about a body, which is very different. When we look at what we know about Stoic logic, the first thing that stands out is how much more complicated it is than Aristotelian logic. It was a time of learning, and the Stoics could improve and set themselves apart as much as they wanted. As for immediate inference, a topic that has caused some debate among us, Chrysippus thought that there were more than 1,000,000 possible changes that could be made to 10 propositions. Hipparchus, a mathematician, disagreed with him and showed that the affirmative proposition had 103,049 forms and the negative had 310,962. In our case, the positive statement has more effects than the negative one. The Stoics, on the other hand, weren't happy with just negation. They also had negative, arnetic, and privative, as well as supernegative statements. Another thing that stands out is that the three figures of Aristotle are not present at all. Instead, only the moods of complicated syllogisms are talked about, like the modus ponens in a conjunctive. They thought like this: if A, then B, but A, B. The Stoics came up with this rule about the material quality of conjunctive statements because they thought they were very important. Truth can only come after truth, but falsehood can come after either truth or falsehood. So, if it is said to be true that it is day, then any statement that follows from that, like that it is light, must also be true. A lie, on the other hand, could lead either way. If it is falsely said that it is night, for example, then it is also wrongly said that it is dark. But if we say the earth flies, which was thought to be not only wrong but also impossible, then the earth is what it really is. Even though Diogenes Laertius only gives a brief outline of Stoic logic, the simple syllogism comes up a lot in the stories of their cases that we have. Take Zeno's syllogism, for example. One does not confide in a drunk man. This was used to support the cause of temperance. It is okay to tell a good man a secret. A good person won't get drunk. The chain argument, which we mistakenly call the Sorites, was also very useful to the Stoics. A shortened series must be effective if a single syllogism was insufficient to convince men of virtue. They then showed that being wise was enough to make someone happy by saying, "A wise man is temperate, a temperate person is constant, a constant person is unperturbed, an unperturbed person is free from sorrow, a person free from sorrow is happy, a wise man is happy." The early Stoics loved this pure intellectual game, which is why they jumped all over the many false ideas that were popular among the Greeks at the time. Most of these ideas came from the Megarians, especially Eubulides of Miletus, who was a student of Euclides. However, both friends and foes of the Stoics linked them to them, and they were praised for how subtle they were, or made fun of for how serious they were when dealing with them. If you tell the mysteries to people who aren't initiated, you're guilty of impiety. The Hierophant told the mysteries to people who weren't initiated. The Hierophant is guilty of impiety. Anything you say goes through your mouth. You say a wagon goes through your mouth. 11 books have been said to be written about the No One Error, but the famous Lyre, which Eubulides is said to have created, seems to have been where he used most of his creativity. In its most basic form, this error looks like this. Are you saying the truth or lying if you honestly say that you are lying? Chrysippus wrote that this could not be explained. In any case, he wasn't refusing to talk about it. He wrote a 5-book treatise on the inexplicables, an introduction to the liar and liars for introduction, 6 books on the liar itself, a work attacking people who said such claims were both false and true, another work attacking people who said they could solve the liar by dividing things, 3 books on how to solve the liar, and finally a polemic against people who said the liar was based on false premises. It was good for Philetas of Kos that he died before Chrysippus was born, even though he got fat and died because of the liar. His epitaph was a solemn warning to poets not to mess with logic. Philetas of Kos am I. It was the liar who killed me and the bad nights that it caused. We might need to say sorry for the translation. In order to talk about the first rules of reasoning, we had to talk about the Stoics' mental health. It is just as important to do that now that we are talking about the basis of ethics. We've been told that the Stoics thought the soul had 8 parts. These were the 5 senses, the brain, the ear, the tongue, and the sexual force. You will notice that the emotions are missing, which stands out. The Stoic view was that the emotions were just the mind that had become sick because of the perversions of untruth. Because of this, the Stoics didn't deal with emotion. They thought that if it got into the soul's fortress, it would take over as the proper master. It might have been nice if reason could keep emotion in check if they were 2 separate things. Instead, passion and reason were just 2 different states of the same thing, a worse and a better one. The pure mind was the rightful king or queen of the country of man. That's why the Stoics often called it the guiding principle. This was the part of the soul that had fantasies and also where emotions came from, which is what we're going to talk about next. One of the things that drove people to act was their impulse or desire. In its natural state, it was only aimed at things that were in line with nature. We will call the opposite of this principle, or the desire to stay away from things that are against nature, rejection. Not only did Stoic morals reach great heights, it was also said to be built on self-love. In this way, the Stoics were similar to other old schools of thought. When an animal was first born, its first instinct was to protect itself and its natural traits, which made it very comfortable. It looked for things that would help it stay alive and avoided things that would hurt it. So, the first law of life was to protect yourself. Man was once just an animal before he developed reason. Things that were in line with his nature at that time included health, strength, good physical condition, soundness of all the senses, beauty, speed, in short, all the things that made up the richness of physical life and contributed to the vital harmony. People called these the first things that made sense in light of nature. All of their opposites were against nature, like sickness, weakness, and cutting. Along with the first things that were in line with nature came good things for the mind, like wisdom that comes quickly, natural talent, hard work, memory, and so on. The question was whether pleasure should be added to the list. Some people in the school seemed to think that it might be, but the majority thought that pleasure was more of an afterthought, and that going after it directly was bad for the body. Having virtue led to happiness, joy, and other similar things. These were the spirit's frolickings, like an animal in its prime or a plant in bloom. Because the same power showed up in all levels of nature, though at each level it was stronger than the last. The plant had the ability to grow, but the animal added sense and drive. When an animal became aware of itself as a rational being, it was natural for it to follow the impulses of its senses. But when a person added reason to his senses and impulses, it became natural for him to let this new and master hand shape all of his impulses. Because of this, virtue was very much in line with nature. The Stoics thought that reason and emotion were connected. What do we need to ask now? Is reason just the leading force and emotion the driving force? When instinct is linked to emotion, Seneca speaks out against this point of view. One reason he gives for this is that reason and emotion would be on the same level if they were both needed for action in the same way. The Stoics said that passion was an excessive impulse, so even according to Stoic ideas, is it possible for reason to work without something else helping it? It's possible that reason is itself a rule for what to do. Here, Plutarch comes to our aid. He quotes Chrysippus as saying that impulse is the reason of man commanding him to act, and that repulsion is prohibitive reason. This makes the Stoic position clear, and we must align our minds with it even though it is hard. Just like we saw that reason is not very different from sense, it now looks like reason is not only different from impulse, but also impulse itself in its best form. When impulse and reason are not the same thing, at least in a logical being, it is not really impulse but emotion. It will be seen that the Stoics thought about things in terms of evolution. However, they did not think that mind came from matter, just like many evolutionists do today. It was thought that all living things already had what they called seminal reasons, which explained why plants and animals were smart. There were 4 main emotions, just like there were 4 main virtues. These were happiness, sadness, hunger, and fear. It didn't matter what they thought was going to happen. They were all excited about it. What made people want something caused them to be happy when it was there, and what made them afraid when it was there caused them to be sad. So, 2 of the main interests were about good things, and 2 were about bad things. All of these things were furies that lived in fools' lives and made them nasty and painful, and philosophy's job was to fight them. These fights were not lost either, because the emotions were not based in reality, but on false beliefs. They began in decisions that people made on their own, and they were born because people weren't thinking straight. Men should stay away from emotions at all costs if they want to live their life in peace and quiet. After naming the 4 main emotions, it was necessary to explain the separation by putting different types of feelings under these 4 main categories. The Stoics were very careful in this job, which is more interesting to a lexicographer than to a philosophy student. They put a lot of weight on where words came from as a guide to what they meant. Since their grammar wasn't limited by any rules, their creativity could go as crazy as it wanted. Even though all emotion was self-condemned, there were still some eupathies, or happy feelings, that the perfect good and wise man would feel. They weren't changes in the soul, but rather constancies. They weren't against reason, but rather a part of it. Even though the sage would never be filled with happiness, he would always feel joy when he was with the true and only good. He would never be moved by desire, but he would be moved by wish, because it was only for the good. And even though he would never feel fear, he would still be moved by proper caution when he was in danger. So, there was a reasonable response to 3 of the 4 main emotions. For example, joy should be set against pleasure, but there was nothing to set against grief, because it came from having something bad happen, which the sage would rather never have. It was illogical to think that you should hurt yourself when there was no reason to. This was called grief. The Stoics looked up to Socrates' pure calmness. Xanthippe said that Socrates always had the same face when he left the house in the morning and when he came back at night. As the different types of emotions followed the flags of their 4 leaders, so were the 3 eupathies given different types of feelings that were okay with reason. Zeno put things into 3 groups: good, bad, and neutral. Good things had virtue and things that were like virtue. Bad things had vice and things that were like vice. Everything else didn't matter. Then there was the 3rd class, which had things like life and death, health and sickness, pleasure and pain, beauty and ugliness, strength and weakness, honor and shame, wealth and poverty, win and loss, and high birth and low birth. What was said to be good was that which helps. Giving benefit was just as important to good as giving warmth was to heat. If you asked what to benefit meant, you would be told that it meant doing something that was in line with virtue, and vice versa. The meaning of good made it clear that it didn't care about anything other than virtue and vice, which meant that it was basically helpful. There was no such thing as good or bad, because things like health and wealth could be helpful or not helpful, depending on the situation. Again, nothing could really be good if how it was used determined whether it was good or bad. But this was the case with health and wealth. Back then, the only real good was the same thing that the Greeks called the beautiful, and we call the right. Things that were good were also things that were right, and things that were good were also things that were right. This idea that good and right are the same thing and bad and wrong are the same thing was at the heart of Stoic ethics. It was said that the right had everything a person needed to live a happy life. On the other hand, the wrong was the only thing that was bad and made people unhappy, whether they knew it or not. Since virtue was the goal, it was a choice that could be made without caring about or being afraid of what might happen. Also, since it was the greatest good, adding things that didn't matter wouldn't make it better. The only way it could grow was to stay alive longer. The question wasn't about how much there was, but how good it was. For all time, virtue wasn't more virtue, so it wasn't more good than virtue for a moment. Still, it didn't matter what width you chose for a circle, it was still a circle. It also wouldn't change how perfect a circle was if it was erased right away in the same dust it was drawn in. The good of men lay in virtue was the same thing as the good of reason, since virtue was the best form of reason. Nature had made man different from other animals only through reason, so to live a logical life was to follow nature. It was both God's law and man's law at the same time. That's because by the nature of something was meant not what we find it to be, but what it was clearly meant to become in the endless fit of things. So, to be happy meant to be good. To be good meant to be rational. To be rational meant to follow nature. And to follow nature meant to obey God. Virtue added to life that even flow that Zeno said was what made people happy. This was reached when a person's mind was in sync with the will that made everything happen. Socrates and the Stoics both thought that virtue is knowledge, because after virtue was cleaned of all the filth of feelings, it became something purely rational. The four cardinal virtues of wisdom, temperance, courage, and justice were also adopted by them from Plato and described as various fields of study. Folly, intemperance, cowardice, and injustice were set up as four primary vices to fight these. There was a detailed list of traits that fit into each of the virtues and vices. Even though the Stoics carefully split and separated the virtues, their teaching said that virtue was always one and could not be split. Reason was what virtue was, and if reason were real, it would govern all aspects of behavior. Greek thought already knew about the paradox, he who has one virtue has all. But Chrysippus went further and said that he who displayed one virtue did so by displaying all. He said that neither the person who did not possess all the virtues nor the action that did not involve all of them were perfect. The only thing that made the virtues different was the order in which they put things. Each virtue was first itself, and then all the others. Wisdom had to figure out what was right, but that required the other virtues as well. Temperance had to keep the urges in check, but how could someone be called temperate if they quit their job out of fear, didn't return a deposit out of greed, which is a form of injustice, or messed up their business because they were rash, which is a form of foolishness? Courage had to face risks and problems, but it wasn't courage unless they did it. If you lose one virtue, you would lose all of them. The Stoics didn't shy away from coming to the opposite conclusion of this paradox. He who has one vice has all vices. You could lose some of your Corinthian ware and still keep the rest, but if you lost one virtue, you would lose them all. Here we have the first paradox of Stoicism, which can be traced back to the idea that virtue is the same thing as pure reason. When talking about Zeno's new ideas, Cicero says that while earlier teachers had said that virtues came from nature and habit, he made them all depend on reason. This led to a reaffirmation of Plato's or his followers' view that virtue can be taught. But the role that nature and habit played in this was important. Moving on from good and bad, we now move on to things that don't matter. So far, the Stoic philosophy has been strict and unwilling to bend. This time, we need to look at it from a different angle and see how it tried to make sense. Things that didn't necessarily lead to virtue, like health, wealth, power, and respect, were thought to be indifferent. You can have all of these things and still not be good, and you can also be good without them. And now we need to learn that even though these things aren't good or bad, so we can't choose to do them or stay away from them, that doesn't mean they're neutral. Instead, they are very different from that. That being said, some things really don't care either way, like whether you stick out your finger this way or that, bend down to pick up a straw or not, or have an odd or even number of hairs on your head. But things like this are very rare. Aside from virtue and sin, most things make us feel either propelled or pushed away. So, let's understand that the word indiscriminate can mean two things. 1, not good or bad, and 2, not arousing or repelling. What this means is that some things didn't care either way. They were either in line with nature or against nature, but not both. In this case, the senses health, strength, and soundness were in line with nature, while their sickness, weakness, and damage were not. Of course, things like the soul's flaws and the body's weakness were neither in line with nature nor against nature. They were just nature. Everything that was in line with nature had value, and everything that wasn't in line with nature had disvalue. In the very highest sense of the word value, that of pure value or worth, things that weren't affected by nature had no value at all, but they could still have what Antipater called a selective value, or, more sarcastically, a disselective disvalue. If something had a selective value, you chose it over its opposite, like health over sickness, wealth over poverty, or life over death, if the circumstances allowed it. This is why these things were called takeable, and the opposites were called untakeable. The things that had a lot of value were called preferred, and the things that didn't have much value were called rejected. People who didn't have a lot of either quality were neither liked nor disliked. Zeno, who came up with these names, said that they could be used for things that didn't really matter, because preference could only be given to the king's officials at court, not the king himself. Things that are liked and disliked could be in the mind, the body, or the land. Regarding the mind, things that were good were things like natural talent, art, moral growth, and so on. Things that were bad were not accepted. When it came to the body, people liked life, health, strength, good condition, completeness, and beauty more than death, sickness, weakness, bad condition, mutilation, and ugliness. Things outside of the mind and body that were valued were wealth, name, and royalty. Things that were valued less were poverty, bad character, and being born into a low family. After the Stoics politely turned away all common and purchasable goods at the front door, they were sneaked in through a kind of tradesman's entrance under the guise of things indifferent. Now we need to look at how they had two sets of rules for morality, one for the wise person and one for everyone else. While anyone could do the right thing, only the sage could do the proprieties. For example, anyone could honor their parents, but only the sage did it out of wisdom, because he was the only one who knew the art of life, which was to do everything with the best attitude. If you look at what the wise man did, it was perfect propriety, which was also called rightnesses. On the other hand, everything else men did was sin or wrongness. At best, what other people did was intermediate propriety. This means that the word propriety can mean any of these things. But, as is often the case, the general word came to mean a specific thing over time. This is why proprieties are used to describe middle ground actions instead of rightnesses. Examples of rightnesses are being wise and fair, while examples of proprieties or middle ground actions are marrying, going on an embassy, and dialectic. People often use the word duty to describe the Greek word that we are translating as propriety. Since we don't have a real word for the term, any version is just a choice of evils. Not only did it apply to how people behave, but it also applied to how animals behave and even to how plants grow. Now, unless we're making broad assumptions, we probably shouldn't think of the stern daughter of the voice of God in terms of an amoeba responding well to a trigger. However, the creature is showing a vague similarity to duty. According to its roots, Zeno was the first person to use the word in question and explain what it meant, what it came naturally to do. For this reason, becomingness would be the best translation. Even whether it was right to live or die depended on nature and how things were stacked up. It had nothing to do with goodness or badness. As Cleanthes, a poet and philosopher, put it, it was as if nature had begun an iambic line and left men to finish it. They had to wear the fool's cap until that was done. Seneca likes to say that the wise person is like the skilled person. The sage is like someone who is completely healthy, while the proficient is like someone who is healing from a serious sickness. For the proficient, stopping their symptoms is the same thing as being healthy, but they are always at risk of returning. Philosophy's job is to take care of these weaker minds. People still call the smart person a fool, but it's made clear that he's not like the other fools. There are also 3 groups of skilled people, which makes me think of some parts of Calvinist ideology. Someone is close to being wise, but they are still on the wrong side of the door to heaven. Some doctors said that these people couldn't go backwards because, like the sage, they didn't yet realize that they had reached enlightenment. Other authorities wouldn't agree with this, though, and said that the first class was only safe from permanent diseases of the soul and not from short-lived attacks of passion. People who had given up on the worst mental diseases and interests were in the second group. They could easily go back to them, though. It was made up of people who had beaten one mental illness but not another, who had beaten lust but not desire, and who were okay with death but feared pain. In the past, people may have been interested in Stoicism because it seemed to contradict itself in these ways. Like, if you want to become popular as a poet, it might help to be unknown rather than good at writing. Since Stoicism is a paradox, it makes sense that the ideas that came from it would also be paradoxes. Virtue is the highest good is something that everyone who wants to live a moral life has to say, even if they don't believe it. But if you change it to virtue is the only good, it's a big contradiction. Something that goes against what most people think is called a paradox. Certain things have been thought of as good, are being thought of as good, and will continue to be thought of as good. But if we accept this first paradox, many more will follow, such as the idea that virtue is sufficient of itself for happiness. Cicero's 5th book of Tusculan Disputations is a strong case against the idea that a good man isn't happy when he is being smashed in the head. All faults are equal was another big issue with the Stoics. They thought that something was either right or wrong, like how a line or an angle is either straight or crooked. Nobody can find a center ground or a level of either. It doesn't matter how far you go. Any straying is forbidden. To sin is to cross the line. Besides, every fool is crazy. Only the sage is free, and every fool is a slave. The sage alone is rich. Good men are always happy, and bad men are always miserable. All goods are equal, while no one is wiser or happier than another, others say. We want to know if someone could be almost smarter or happier than someone else. The Stoics would state, that may be, but the person who is only one stade from Canopus is just as much not in Canopus as the person who is 100 stades away, and the 8-day-old puppy is still as blind as the day it was born, and a person who is close to the surface of the sea can't breathe any more than if he were 500 fathoms below. In ancient Greece, contradictions were common, and the Stoics were the best at making them. No wise man is unhappy, Epicurus said, and if that wasn't true, he said that a wise man would say, "How delightful," if he was put into the bull of Phalaris. It was said that Socrates was the father of paradox. What a small thing this is to me. Even though Christ said that would happen on the day of judgment, the Stoics insisted on making a clear separation between good and evil right now. Unfortunately, when it came time to practice, they found that everyone was a goat, so the separation was only formal. The good person among the Stoics was called the sage, or the serious man, with the latter name coming from the Peripatetics. We used to joke that someone became serious when they started going to church. Another name for the sage among the Stoics was the urbane man, and a fool was called a boor. A boor didn't know the state's rules and laws. In the past, when they said state, they meant places like Athens or Sparta. Now they meant the society of all rational beings that the Stoics spiritualized the state into. In this city, only the wise person was free, so the fool was not only a jerk, but also an outsider or an alien. The Stoics spiritualized both the law and the state, so it didn't mean the rules of this or that society. It meant the rules of timeless reason that ruled the world and would rule in an ideal state. Law was right reason telling people what to do and what not to do. In this way, it was the same as the sage's own impulse. As a citizen of a state and naturally subject to law, man was a social being. The wise had unanimity, which meant a knowledge of the common good, because their views on life were the same. Fools, on the other hand, had opposite views on life and were enemies. It was always the case that the wise man would be involved in public life as a citizen. In practice, he would do so whenever the Constitution allowed for a reasonable approach to the ideal type. But if it was clear that getting involved in politics would hurt his country and put him in danger, he would not do it. A mix of democratic, noble, and monarchical parts of government was what the Stoics liked best about it. When the time was right, a smart person would be a lawmaker and teach people. One way they did this was by making books that people could use. The wise man would get married and have kids right now, for himself and for his country, which he would suffer and die for if it were good. But he would also look forward to a better time when, in Zeno's and Plato's republics, the wise would share women and kids, the older generation would love all the younger generation equally, and there would be no more marital jealousy. Because he was naturally social, the sage was good at politics and the nicer things in life. He was polite, friendly, and stimulating, and he used conversation to make friends and build goodwill. He was all things to all men, which made him interesting, charming, sneaky, and even smart. He knew how to get to the point and pick the right moment, but he was also simple and unassuming. Next, we'll talk about the sage's very anti-social side. One of his most praised qualities was his ability to take care of himself. He wanted to be able to walk out of a burning city, where his fortunes and the lives of his friends and family were destroyed, and say with a smile that he had lost nothing. He really only wanted to be centered in himself, because that was the only way he knew fortune would smile on him. The apathy or passionlessness of the sage is another of his most salient features. The passions, being on Zeno's showing, not natural, but forms of disease, the sage, as being the perfect man, would of course be wholly free from them. They were so many disturbances of the even flow in which his bliss lay. The sage, therefore, would never be moved by a feeling of favor towards anyone. He would never pardon a fault. He would never feel pity. He would never be prevailed upon by entreaty. He would never be stirred to anger. As to the absence of pity in the sage, the Stoics themselves must have felt some difficulty there, since we find Epictetus recommending his hearers to show grief out of sympathy for another, but to be careful not to feel it. The inexorability of the sage was a mere consequence of his calm reasonableness, which would lead him to take the right view from the first. Lastly, the sage would never be stirred to anger, for why should it stir his anger to see another in his ignorance injuring himself? One more touch has yet to be added to the apathy of the sage. He was impervious to wonder. No miracle of nature could excite his astonishment, no mephitic caverns, which men deemed the mouths of hell, no deep-drawn ebb tides, the standing marvel of the Mediterranean dweller, no hot springs, no spouting jets of fire. From the absence of passion, it is but a step to the absence of error. So we pass now to the infallibility of the sage, a monstrous doctrine that was never broached in the schools before Zeno. The sage, it was maintained, held no opinions. He never repented of his conduct. He was never deceived in anything. Between the daylight of knowledge and darkness of nescience, Plato had interposed the twilight of opinion, wherein men walked for the most part. Not so, however, the Stoic sage. Of him it might be said, as Charles Lamb said of the Scotchman with whom he so imperfectly sympathized, "His understanding is always at its meridian. You never see the first dawn, the early streaks. He has no falterings of self-suspicion, surmises, guesses, misgivings, half-intuitions, semi-consciousness, partial illuminations, dim instincts, embryo conceptions, have no place in his brain or vocabulary. The twilight of dubiety never falls upon him. Opinion, whether in the form of an ungrasped assent or a weak supposition, was alien from the mental disposition of the serious man. With him there was no hasty or premature assent of the understanding, no forgetfulness, no distrust. He never allowed himself to be overreached or deluded, never had the need of an arbiter, never was out in his reckoning, nor put out by another. No urbane man ever wandered from his way, or missed his mark, or saw wrong, or heard amiss, or erred in any of his senses. He never conjectured nor thought of a better thing, for the one was a form of imperfect assent, and the other a sign of previous precipitancy. There was with him no change, no retraction, and no tripping. These things were for those whose dogmas could alter. After this, it is almost superfluous for us to be assured that the sage never got drunk. Drunkenness, as Zeno pointed out, involved babbling, and of that the sage would never be guilty. He would not, however, altogether eschew banquets. Indeed, the Stoics recognized a virtue under the name of conviviality, which consisted in the proper conduct of them. It was said of Chrysippus that his demeanor was always quiet, even if his gait were unsteady, so that his housekeeper declared that only his legs were drunk. There were pleasantries even within the school on this subject of the infallibility of the sage. Aristo of Chios, while seceding on some other matters, held fast to the dogma that the sage never opined. Whereupon Perseus played a trick upon him. He made one of two twin brothers deposit a sum of money with him, and the other call to reclaim it. The success of the trick, however, only went to establish that Aristo was not the sage, an admission that each of the Stoics seems to have been ready enough to make on his own part, as the responsibilities of the position were so fatiguing. There remains one more leading characteristic of the sage, the most striking of them all, and the most important from the ethical point of view. This was his innocence or harmlessness. He would not harm others and was not to be harmed by them. For the Stoics believed with Socrates that it was not permissible by the divine law for a better man to be harmed by a worse. You could not harm the sage any more than you could harm the sunlight. He was in our world, but not of it. There was no possibility of evil for him, save in his own will, and that you could not touch. And as the sage was beyond harm, so also was he above insult. Men might disgrace themselves by their insolent attitude towards his mild majesty, but it was not in their power to disgrace him. As the Stoics had their analogue to the tenet of final assurance, so had they also to that of sudden conversion. They held that a man might become a sage without being at first aware of it. The abruptness of the transition from folly to wisdom was in keeping with their principle that there was no medium between the two, but it was naturally a point that attracted the strictures of their opponents. That a man should be at one moment stupid and ignorant and unjust and intemperate, a slave and poor and destitute, at the next a king, rich and prosperous, temperate and just, secure in his judgments and exempt from error, was a transformation, they declared, which smacked more of the fairy tales of the nursery than of the doctrines of a sober philosophy. Physic. We have now before us the main facts with regard to the Stoic view of man's nature, but we have yet to see in what setting they were put. What was the Stoic outlook upon the universe? The answer to this question is supplied by their physic. There were, according to the Stoics, two first principles of all things, the active and the passive. The passive was that unqualified being which is known as matter. The active was the logos, or reason in it, which is God. This, it was held, eternally pervades matter and creates all things. This dogma, laid down by Zeno, was repeated after him by the subsequent heads of the school. There were then two first principles, but there were not two causes of things. The active principle alone was cause, the other was mere material for it to work on, inert, senseless, destitute in itself of all shape and qualities, but ready to assume any qualities or shape. Matter was defined as that out of which anything is produced. The prime matter, or unqualified being, was eternal and did not admit of increase or decrease, but only of change. It was the substance or being of all things that are. The Stoics, it will be observed, used the term matter with the same confusing ambiguity with which we use it ourselves, now for sensible objects that have shape and other qualities, now for the abstract conception of matter, which is devoid of all qualities. Both these first principles, it must be understood, were conceived of as bodies, though without form, the one everywhere interpenetrating the other. To say that the passive principle, or matter, is a body comes easy to us because of the familiar confusion adverted to above. But how could the active principle, or God, be conceived of as a body? The answer to this question may sound paradoxical. It is because God is a spirit. A spirit in its original sense meant air in motion. Now the active principle was not air, but it was something that bore an analogy to it, namely ether. Ether in motion might be called a spirit as well as air in motion. It was in this sense that Chrysippus defined the thing that is, to be a spirit moving itself into and out of itself, or spirit moving itself to and fro. From the two first principles, which are ungenerated and indestructible, must be distinguished the four elements which, though ultimate for us, yet were produced in the beginning by God, and are destined someday to be reabsorbed into the divine nature. These, with the Stoics, were the same which had been accepted since Empedocles, namely earth, air, fire, and water. The elements, like the two first principles, were bodies. Unlike them, they were declared to have shape as well as extension. An element was defined as that out of which things at first come into being, and into which they are at last resolved. In this relation did the four elements stand to all, the compound bodies which the universe contained. The words earth, air, fire, and water had to be taken in a broad sense. For example, earth meant everything that was earthly, air meant everything that was airy, and so on. If you look at a person, the bones and sinews are earthly. It was hot, cold, wet, and dry, which meant that the four elements were present. Fire provided heat, air provided cold, water provided wetness, and earth provided dryness. Together, the four elements made up the unqualified being called matter. All animals and other compound natures on Earth had representatives of the four major physical components of the universe, but Chrysippus said that the moon was only made up of fire and air. All complex shapes could be broken down into their four elements, but there were big differences between the elements themselves. Fire and air were light, while water and earth were heavy. Light refers to something that moves away from its center, and heavy refers to something that moves toward it. The two light elements were similar to the two heavy elements in many ways, like how the active and passive principles are similar. But fire also had a primary that made it deserving of being called an element on its own, if the definition of an element were to be pressed. This is because the three other elements came from fire and would return to it. We would have the wrong idea of what Bishop Berkeley calls the philosophy of fire if we think of the raging element whose strength is in destruction. Instead, let us picture ourselves as the type of F. According to Zeno, there were two types of fire, one that destroyed things and the other that he called constructive or artistic. This second type of fire, called ether, was what made up the heavenly bodies, as well as the souls of animals and the nature of plants. Chrysippus, following Heraclitus, said that the elements changed into each other through a process of condensation and rarefaction. Fire first turned into a solid. There is a theory from the Middle Ages that suggests there are four states of matter: solid, liquid, gaseous, and a fourth state beyond gaseous that scientists still don't fully understand, but where matter seems to join with spirit. Each of the four elements had its own place in the universe. At the very top was the ethereal fire, which was split into two spheres, one for the fixed stars and one for the planets. Below that was the sphere of air, and below that was the sphere of water. Finally, at the very bottom, or most central, was the sphere of earth, which was the solid base of the whole structure. You could say that water was above earth, because it wasn't anywhere to be found. When we say that the Stoics saw the universe as a plenum, we mean the cosmos, or ordered whole. There was no emptiness inside the plenum because the celestials pressed down on the terrestrial sphere, but outside the plenum was the infinite void that had no beginning, middle, or end. This was a very confusing part of their view. It wasn't being because being was limited to the body, but it was there. It was nothing, and that's what. To answer this question, we need to use different words, just like the Stoics did. They said that the all was infinite, but the whole was finite. This is because the all was the cosmos and the void, while the whole was just the cosmos. We think that this difference came from later members of the school, since Apollodorus said that the word all could mean either the cosmos only or the cosmos plus the void. In this case, universe refers to the world or the ordered whole. The Stoics thought that the universe had limits. They believed that all being and all body, which was the same thing as being, had limits. Only not being had limits. When the Stoics talked about the three words void, place, and space, they liked to make a distinction between them. Void meant the absence of body, place meant that which was occupied by body, and space meant that which was partly occupied and partly unoccupied. Since there was nowhere in the universe that wasn't filled with body, Space was another name for the all. Place was like a vessel. But the Stoics saw our universe as an island of being in an ocean of void. They didn't believe that there might be other islands like ours that we don't know about. The spectacle of the starry heavens, which they saw every night in all the glory of a southern sky, was the only thing that existed. Beyond that, there was nothing. Democritus or the Epicureans might have dreamed of other worlds, but the Stoics believed that the universe was one solid thing. A sphere was thought to be the perfect shape for the universe because it was both perfect and best suited for motion. However, the universe as a whole did not move. The Earth lay in the center, spherical and still, and the sun, moon, and planets circled it like many concentric rings. The outermost ring, which held the fixed stars, moved around the rest at an unimaginable speed. According to Zeno, the Earth stayed in the middle because everything in the universe moved toward the center. This meant that the Earth was under equal pressure on all sides. The same thing kept the universe at rest in the void, but in an infinite void, it didn't matter whether the whole thing was at rest or moving. Zeno may have come up with the strange idea that the universe has no weight to get away from the idea that the whole thing moves around. The universe was the only thing that was perfect in and of itself. It was an end in itself. All other things were perfect as parts of the whole, but none of them were ends in themselves, unless you count man, who was created to think about the universe and try to be like it in every way. This is how the Stoics saw the universe physically, as one, limited, fixed in space, but rotating around its own center. But there could not have been order and beauty without mind. The universe was filled with intelligence, just like a person's soul is filled with his body. But just like a person's soul is not present everywhere in the same degree, so it was with the world soul. The human soul shows itself not only as intellect, but also as sense, growth, and unity. It is the soul that makes plants grow. In the same way, the world soul showed up in rational beings as intellect, in lower animals as souls, in plants as nature or growth, and in inorganic substances as holding or cohesion. If you add change to the lowest stage, you get nature or growth of plants. If you add fantasy and impulse to this, you get the soul of irrational animals. And if you add still more, you get the rational and discursive intellect that is unique to man among mortal nature. We've talked about soul as the source of plant life in our bodies, but the Stoics didn't think plants had soul in the strictest sense. Instead, they thought plants were driven by nature or growth. The Stoics described nature as a constructive fire, proceeding in a regular way to production, or a fiery spirit endowed with artistic skill. Nature was an artist didn't need to be proven, since in its broadest sense, nature was another name for providence, or the principle that held the universe together. But in the sense that it is used now, nature refers to the level of existence that is above cohesion and below soul. It was described as a cohesion subject to self-originated change in accordance with seminal reasons, effecting and maintaining its results indefinitely and reproducing in the offspring the characteristics of the pare. It's also important to understand that when the Stoics talked about cohesion, they weren't talking about an abstract idea like attraction. Chrysippus said, "Cohesions are nothing else than airs, because it's airs that hold bodies together." Airs are also the cause of the qualities of things that are held together by cohesion, like hardness in iron, thickness in stone, and whiteness in silver. Not only was unity thought to come from air, but so did colors, which Zeno called the first schematisms of matter. In fact, qualities were nothing more than blasts and pressures of air that gave shape and form to the lifeless matter beneath them. In one sense, a person is the soul, in another, the body, and in a third, they are both together. The same was true for the universe. One meaning was God, another was the arrangement of the stars, and the third was the union of both. The world was seen as the same thing as God, a person made up of all beings that can't be changed and wasn't made. This person created the universe's order, and at certain times takes all beings into himself, and then makes them again from himself. So the cosmos on the outside was doomed to die, and fire was going to be the way it did it. This idea has become a part of everyone's belief system and has stuck around to this day. The end of the world would happen when the soul of the universe got too big for its body, which it would then swallow up completely. When everything burned up and went back to the original ether, the world would be pure soul and alive all the way through. Since it was weaker and less intense now, it would need more space than before, so it would grow into the void and then shrink back down when another time of cosmic generation started. This is why the Stoics said that the void or infinite is where the universe ends when it explodes. There is a connection between this idea that the universe contracted from a spiritual state and will eventually return to the same state. It is like the modern science idea that our solar system formed from the solar nebula and will end in the same place. The way Cleanthes thought about the theory is a good example of this. He thought that the heavenly bodies were speeding up their own destruction by crashing into the sun like a bunch of huge moths. But Cleanthes didn't think that this was just a matter of mechanical force at work. He saw that the highest point of suicide would be a choice act, since the bodies in the sky were gods and would give up their own lives for a bigger one. So, all the gods except Zeus were mortal, or at least they would die. Gods, like people, were bound to have an end at some point. As if they were made of wax or tin, they would melt in the great fire of being. After that, Zeus would be left to think, or as the Stoics put it, Zeus would fall back on providence. They meant the mind or guiding principle of the whole thing by providence. When they talked about Zeus, they meant this mind along with the universe, which was like a body to Zeus. The two would become one in the efflagration, which would be made of ether. Then, when the time was right, everything would be put back together again. Everything would go around and around again, just like it had before. We've been told to always try to get better, so this is a sad thought. There was always hope for the Stoics, though, and they didn't want things to change from what was best. They didn't care too much about the players because they were happy with the one story that would never end. The light of life went out, but it wouldn't go out for good because it would be lit again tomorrow. There was a never-ending loop of being and not being. There is no evil to a good man either in life or after death, nor are his affairs neglected by the gods, Socrates stated to his judges. This was the main thought behind Stoicism. It says that virtue is the only thing that is good and that the world is run by providence. As we try to figure out what he meant, let's first think about what he meant. Good people can and do go through many things that most people would call bad. If there is a plan, Seneca is asked why so many bad things happen to good people. He replies, "Nothing bad can happen to a good man. Opposites don't mix." What was bad about the good has been taken away by God. He has taken away their crimes and sins, bad thoughts, selfish plans, blind lust, and greed. They don't expect him to watch their bags because they don't care about them. Epictetus borrowed this short part of the Apology and made it one of the watchwords of Stoicism. People should even blame Socrates for the Stoic paradox that everyone else is crazy. These people didn't teach the Stoics much. It was too balanced for their narrow focus to understand Aristotle's mind. They thought that his recognition of the value of the passions was like supporting disease in moderation. They also thought that his inclusion of things other than virtue in the idea of happiness was a betrayal of the citadel. They thought that his statement that virtue was the highest good was not worthwhile unless it was accompanied by the admission that there was nothing else. They tried to treat people like they were made of pure reason. They wouldn't close their eyes to the fact that he was a mix of different things, and they said that the good of such a being must also be a mix of things that have to do with the body and its surroundings. They did say that the goods of the soul were much more important than those of the body and land, but they said that the latter should still be taken into account. The Stoics were very religious, almost to the point of belief, but they didn't use the scary things of religion to teach people how to be good. Even in the work whose stated goal is to show that fairness is inherently better than wrong, Plato does this. Chrysippus, on the other hand, spoke out against Plato's approach on this point, saying that the talk about judgment by the gods was just a problem. Both the Stoics and the Epicureans got rid of the idea that you should be afraid of the gods. The Epicurean gods didn't get involved in people's lives, and the Stoic god couldn't get mad. Being able to avoid talking about awards and punishments was a logical result of the Stoic moral principle that virtue is itself the best thing in the world. Something else that follows directly from the same concept is that it is better to be good than to look good. People who really believe that happiness comes from money, pleasure, or power like the things that they are instead of how they look. The same goes for people who really believe that virtue is what makes them happy. The Stoics were the first people to fully recognize the worth of man as a person. They predicted the reign of peace that we are still waiting for, told the world that God was father and man was brother, and believed that everyone was connected and that everyone's needs should come before their own. Like Plato's Republic, Aristotle's ideal state is still a Greek city. Zeno was the first person to imagine a republic that would include everyone. In Plato's Republic, the lower classes are treated badly when it comes to actual goods, while the better classes are given mental and spiritual goods. As Aristotle saw it, most of the people in a state are just factors and not essential parts of it. Because Aristotle was so cold-hearted about slavery, he couldn't see the bigger picture, which was already starting to be seen at the time of his writing. His ideas about the natural slave and the natural dignity of the Greeks are just ways to explain what he does. There is some acceptance of man's rights in the ethics, but it's not very strong. In that place, Aristotle says that a slave, like a man, can be treated fairly, which means that they can be friends. However, this is not what his system is based on. It is the idea that a slave is nothing more than a live tool. As Aristotle says in another section, people, like other animals, naturally care about people of the same species. He also says that moving is the best way to see this. It looks like Aristotle's followers grew this early humanitarianism in a much more noticeable way. But the Stoics deserve credit for starting this kind of thinking. For early Greek thinkers, virtue was something only the wealthy and important could have. Like Christianity, Stoicism was open to the worst people in the world. The kingdom of knowledge was the same as the kingdom of Christ. There were no barbarians, Scythians, slaves, or free people there. To serve philosophy or God, which was the same thing, was the only real freedom. You could do that at any point in your life. Being in a certain frame of mind was the only way to communicate with gods and good men. This frame of mind could belong to a prince, a freeman, or a slave. Instead of the Greeks' cocky claim that they were naturally noble, we now hear that a good mind is what makes someone noble. It doesn't matter where you were born. Everyone comes from the gods. There is no one who can't get into the door of virtue. It's open to everyone, slaves, kings, and refugees. Its choice is not family or wealth. It is content with the bare man. Wherever there was a person, Stoicism saw a field for doing good. It was told that Stoics should always say and think, Homo sum humani nihil a me alienum puto. Greek cosmopolitanism goes hand in hand with their concern for others. As time has gone on, the word cosmopolitanism has become less useful instead of more useful. We mean freedom from the chains of country. They meant more than this too. They said that the city they lived in was not just this round world we live on, but the whole universe and all the powerful life that lives in it. Largest towns on earth, like Rome, Ephesus, and Alexandria, were just houses in this city. Being sent away from one of them was like moving from one place to another to live, and death was like moving from one area to another. All of the free men in this city were smart, like teachers on earth or stars in heaven. This kind of thinking fit right in with the high-level wisdom of Stoicism. It was first said by Zeno in his Republic, and then by Chrysippus and his followers after him. It caught the attention of writers from other cultures, like the author of the Peripatetic de Mundo, who may have been Jewish, and Philo and St. Paul, who were definitely Jewish. Cicero always uses it to support the Stoics, Seneca loves it, Epictetus uses it to teach, and Marcus Aurelius finds comfort in the fact that he is a citizen of heaven despite being a master of earth. As Antoninus, his city was Rome, but as a person, it was the world. Some writers seem to think that you can always tell what a time's philosophy is by looking at its political situation, but there are times when the link is clear. In a broad sense, we could say that Alexander's opening up of the East led to the change in philosophy from Hellenism to cosmopolitanism. There is a very real reason for the change of mind if we think about the fact that most of the Cynic and Stoic masters were not from Greece. The world had learned from Greece, and now the world was starting to repay her. People who were once thought to be natural slaves were now giving philosophy rules. There was fighting in the land of knowledge because of outsiders.